You know, it's interesting. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that none of this is really new. Law enforcement has been involved at the state and local level in intelligence gathering as long as there has been law enforcement. And, you know, I think it's important to look back at the history of where abuse has occurred in order to see what were the sort of underlying problems that allowed that abuse to happen. And you know, if we look back to the period, you know, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, where you had law enforcement agencies that were, you know, running red squads or subversive squads or otherwise engaging in a lot of political surveillance and monitoring different politicians as they progressed through different public office. You know, what you find was there was a number of different problems. I mean, one was the vagueness of the terms. You know, even the term intelligence is not really very well defined. I understand the intelligence community doesn't have a definition for it, so, you know, it's unclear what it is we're talking about. And because of the vagueness of the terms, you know, terms like national security or public safety, what that means, a new one that's come up with regard to fusion centers is that they're not just counterterrorism and anti-crime, but also looking to protect against all hazards. You know, so that's an extremely broad mandate. And you know, what we've seen in the past is that law enforcement officers see them not just tied to criminal justice mission, but defenders of the status quo, and they, you know, are then hostile to things like protest or dissent or any challenge to the social order, which drives a lot of the, you know, racial profiling and other improper police activities. So it was very important in the 1970s and 80s when reform began to put in, and Sheriff Bach has already mentioned 28 CFR Part 23, which I'm sure you all know like the back of your hand. But in the law enforcement community, that actually is known like the back of your hand. And FISA mentioned that our interactions with the Information Sharing Environment Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, and I'll say that our allies in that effort in many cases were state and local law enforcement agencies who recognized how important that standard was and were afraid that if the ISE adopted a lower standard, it would harm their own efforts within their communities. So, you know, I think what Matt talks about as far as the federalism system and whether that is effective, I think that is a strong part of why, you know, as communities, we often have far more confidence in our local law enforcement than we do in federal law enforcement or broader the federal intelligence community that's often acting in secret, and what they're doing is hard to know and therefore raises much more suspicion. So what we've seen is post 9/11 that there has been a return to this, you know, what the Church Committee called war psychology, that the national security mission overrides other considerations like civil liberties or other legal constraints, and that didn't come out of a you know, it wasn't sort of like born out of an egg. You know, there was already mechanisms. Intelligence-led policing was sort of a slowly developing concept that was challenging the community policing paradigm and the other paradigms that law enforcement had. And you also had this Joint Terrorism Task Force. But there was also an interest by law enforcement to sort of get away from the constraints that the federal programs allowed, and that's what sort of spurred the development of fusion centers, intelligence fusion centers that were based locally, sometimes at the state level, sometime at regional levels, with really very little clarity on which, you know, it mixed state, local, and often federal law enforcement agencies, and it became very unclear who was actually in charge, what rules applied, and what constraints were there, which led to a lot of problems initially. And then the expansion to suspicious activity reporting, which in its original iteration suggested that it wasn't just crime that the police should be looking for, but other suspicious activities, other illicit intentions, whatever that meant, again, very poorly defined, and sort of empowered police agencies to go out and start collecting information about people in the community that isn't tethered to actual suspicion of criminal misconduct, and that again led to abuse. And this is all sort of lying on a very fractured framework, and that framework is the lack of training that is given to state and local law enforcement officers on what is intelligence collection, what are the national security threats. You know, in addition to the Brennan Center's report, Rethinking Radicalization, which again was sort of being pushed out as this concept of a funnel where, you know, the small number of terrorists come from a discernible pool of believers, and therefore law enforcement should target the believers in the hope of finding the few terrorists rather than being tethered to actual criminal investigations and finding people who are actually involved in wrongdoing rather than who have potentially dangerous thoughts. As well, the Political Research Associates has recently put out a report, Manufacturing the Muslim Menace, which documents a lot of anti-Muslim law enforcement training that is going under the guise of counterterrorism training. And so when you have that foundation on which you're putting the suspicious activity reporting program, the likelihood that people will be targeted because of their religious beliefs rather than because of any suspicion of wrongdoing increases dramatically. And you know, unfortunately, we've seen evidence of this abuse. This isn't just hypothetical. On our website, www.aclu.org/spyfiles, we have information about that we've collected that documents improper police spying or obstruction of First Amendment activities in 33 states in the District of Columbia. And you know, so this is a widespread problem. It's not just the federal government. It's not just the FBI, it's the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, but also state and local law enforcement is often involved in this type of activity. And we see three types of abuse. One is improper targeting and collection, and this is, you know, long-standing law enforcement problems with racial profiling, but also with targeting protesters and others engaged in the political process. And now with this new program of suspicious activity reporting, we're seeing abuse of that, particularly around photography, where people who are merely taking photographs of iconic sites are being stopped. Often their cameras are being confiscated, their photographs deleted, many times being arrested simply for taking photographs. And of course, all of us take photographs on a regular basis. We usually carry a camera in our phone now. So, you know, it's not photography itself that is suspicious, but whatever other biases that the police officer brings to the situation that is likely driving a lot of this improper activity. The second problem is the improper analysis of information. And we've seen this in intelligence reports that have leaked from the fusion centers. And, you know, they are as ridiculous as a North Central Texas Fusion Center report that hypothesized a conspiracy between Muslim civil rights groups, lobbying organizations, anti-war organizations, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and hip-hop bands to spread tolerance in the country that would allow Sharia law to take over. You know, a much longer document from the Virginia Fusion Center that detailed some 50 terrorist groups that were operating within Virginia and identified the diversity at military bases and historically black colleges as nodes of radicalization. You know, and again, another Missouri Fusion Center report on right-wing extremism purported that followers of Ron Paul are potential militia members. You know, again, targeting political activity rather than misconduct. And again, these reports go out to law enforcement agencies. So when you're talking about that one or two man department and they get this report that says universities are nodes of radicalization, what are they to do but to go out and start monitoring universities or these political groups that are identified as potential threats? And the third problem is the improper use or dissemination of information. The Massachusetts auditor recently completed an audit of the Massachusetts criminal intelligence justice system, which has a username and password type of protection. And what they found was the police, being good investigators, were able to identify some terminals where they could access it bypassing that username and password protection. And they used a novel approach. They just picked local celebrities like Tom Brady and Matt Damon. Sorry about that, Matt. And found out they had been searched thousands of times. And of course, that's bad for Tom Brady and Matt Damon. But what that audit doesn't show is how many neighbors of these police officers were searched, how many new boyfriends of the ex-spouse were searched, how many people who the police didn't have a real reason for investigating them but wouldn't pop up in an audit because they're not celebrities. And then we also, with the improper dissemination, recent case in Pennsylvania where the State Department of Homeland Security official hired a private company to spy on local protesters, and that private company and the State Homeland Security Director appeared to be in league with local industries like natural gas drilling and getting information about political protests against the natural gas drillers to those companies, as opposed to actually protecting the public safety. It appeared they were actually protecting the economic viability of an industry, which again is not a law enforcement purpose. So those are the problems we're seeing, and I think oversight is the key way to protect against this, but because this activity is happening in secret and because of the fracture, or because federalism separates these things, when all the entities are working together, who actually can provide that oversight becomes a big question, and that's really been the hardest part. If you have a local officer working on the basis of a regional fusion center report and information provided by the FBI and some harm comes, who's responsible for that? It becomes very difficult questions, and there simply aren't the governance structures necessary to control that type of activity.